3 moons gave birth to Reality 91. There has never been a night when there was only one silver guardian. People on our Earth have always looked up and seen a sky full of friends, from the first time they thought of something to the first time they started a fire in a cave. 3 huge spheres floated above them. Sometimes they were spread out throughout the sky, and other times they came together in weird triangle shapes. The sight was always there, unchanging, and it changed the entire soul of society. Kids grew up counting them. Elders didn't tell stories about one goddess in the sky. They recounted stories about 3 siblings who looked down on people with diverse looks. One was pale and tranquil, with a white light shimmering around it. It was as soft as a palm on the forehead. One crimson and restless, flickering like a coal, always lower on the horizon and heavier. And one blue, far away and dreamy, its light painting rivers and oceans in changing colors. Nights in Reality 91 were never really dark. When one moon went down, another came up. Even when the clouds covered the stars, 1 or 2 moons still shined through. People in this universe didn't fear the dark as much as they did in other worlds. They were afraid of the sea instead. The moonlight tugged on more than just people's eyes. They also pulled on the oceans. The tides were wild and hard to predict. The sea didn't just go up and down, it assaulted. Some days the seas went down so low that whole valleys showed up, but then they came roaring back with waves taller than trees. The coasts were never safe. In just a generation, villages erected near the shore disappeared, and thus early cultures learnt to live in a new way. They built up. Houses were like nests on rocks. Cities arose on stilts like forests of wood and stone that rose out of swamps. In some locations, whole villages chose to retreat below, carving caves into cliffsides to escape the water's wrath. It was hard to go by land because the rivers could flood in a matter of hours. It was even harder to travel by water, yet people didn't give up. They made boats that were stronger than their bones and had hulls that could flex and take the punch of the tide. People feared and worshipped sailors because they were brave enough to play the ocean's game with the 3 moons. This cycle of fear and adaptation helped society grow. Being careful was a good thing in Reality 91. People didn't think that things would last forever. They knew that whole valleys may disappear under the sea, that towns could crumble and that temples could drown. They learned to remember things that would last. Engravings on the highest rocks, songs that spread from mouth to mouth, and stories that told them who they were, even when the waves washed away everything else. The moons also provided them more than just survival. People gave them names that were older than history, and each one was a world in itself, like a mirror in the sky. Selora, the white moon, was the goddess of order, knowledge, and patience. Varak, the red moon, was powerful and cruel, and brought storms and flames. Neris, the dreamer, the unknown, and the delicate glimmer of hope and chaos, was the blue moon. There were different versions of these myths in every country, but the same 3 people always peered down from above. This had a small effect on how they acted. Families typically told their kids that they had a moon soul that was connected to the moon and influenced their nature. Selora gave birth to a serene child, Varak to a fiery one, and Neris to a curious and creative one. Lovers swore their vows under the moon that they thought would bring them good luck. Farmers prayed to Selora for seasons that stayed the same. Warriors marched under Varak, calling her name. Poets and singers chose nights when Neris was at her brightest to showcase their work. Reality 91 never had a worldwide calendar, unlike Earth with only 1 moon. There wasn't one cycle that would work for everyone. Some societies used Selora's peaceful round to tell time. Some used Varak's fast orbit, and still others used Neris's slow drift. Trade between different groups was a mess, but it drove people to keep talking. People learned to be patient since they couldn't agree on when to meet, share, or travel without it. The moons told people to learn how to compromise. But there was always tension under this rhythm of compromise. 3 moons, 3 religions, 3 truths. No one could disagree that they were up there, but each one insisted that they were the best. Someone who was lucky enough to be saved from a storm would say, "Varak asked for a sacrifice and I lived." "Selora's hand protects us," a mother whispered to calm her kid. A dreamer who experienced visions said, "Neris showed me the way." These words led to temples, shrines, and fights that never stopped. Before stone towns started to appear in the valleys, the world of Reality 91 was already split by belief, not by ethnicity or language, but by dedication to the moon. Order and laws thrived where Selora's devotion extended. War and strength were respected in Varak's kingdom. Neris was in charge, and visions, music, and mystery were more important than money or grain. People still came to the seashore to observe the sky, even though these things were different. When the 3 moons lined up in a perfect triangle above on some evenings, everything seemed to stop. Farmers put down their tools. The warriors put down their swords. The sailors tied their ships up. People just stared up, knowing they were insignificant in front of such a big thing. For a little time there was no war, no hunger, and no fear. Just the 3 skies. That was the night Aaron was born. His settlement clung to the cliffs of the southern continent. It was built on stilts over rocks that the seas never spared. His mother sang traditional melodies, while his father was a fisherman. People in the community whispered that he had all 3 moons in his soul the night he was born. Peace, flames, and dreams. His parents just smiled, but Aaron grew up with the weight of that story on his shoulders. He wasn't by himself. The moons in Reality 91 shaped every youngster in ways they couldn't escape as they grew up. As he became older, he started to think, what if the moons weren't gods or myths, but something else? What if we could understand, quantify, and manage their power? This perilous idea would one day lead him, and many others, into a time when myths and science fought like the seas. But at first, in the initial breath of Reality 91, survival was more important than control, and to survive, you had to live in the shadow of 3 giant moons, knowing that they dominated the oceans, the sky, and the souls of everyone who gazed up. There were no roosters or clocks to wake up Aaron's community in the morning. It started with the tide horn. A long, low note echoed up the rock and through the stilts, letting everyone know that the sea had changed. Before they learnt their letters, kids learned the pitch. People climbed when the trumpet sang high. When it sang low, they let the ropes go and dropped the baskets to catch fish for the day. Not by hours, but by safe windows, life was measured. Homes were built on poles made of stone and ironwood, and they were cross-braced like fingers that were knitted together. There were walkways that connected the houses. When the wind blew, they swayed, and when too many people crossed at once, they creaked. The water below gasped, pulling back to show black rock and then coming back in white fists. People kept the rooms below plain because they didn't want anything valuable to get wet. All the treasures were high up. Carved boxes with names on them, dried flowers from a ceremony, and a clay lamp that had been passed down through the years. Anything below was meant to be lost. Before they learned numbers, kids learned how to use ladders. By the time she was 3, Aaron had learned how to climb and how to fall without getting hurt. A hook was fastened to a string on each child's belt. It wasn't wrong to clip in. People thought it was smart. When somebody forgot, someone would silently offer their spare line and look aside while the other person put it on. Pride was good for singing and flirting, but it was bad for the stairs. There were short bursts of activity in the markets. The sea would stay calm long enough for people to set up tables on the upper platforms. There would be fish grilled over seagrass, rope dyed in crushed shell, and carved moons on strings for kids to wear. The next day, the waters would jump and the market would disappear with a trained shrug. No one said anything. People complained about problems that could be fixed. Most people couldn't hear. People learned how to be funny without being mean, patient without being weak, and generous without giving speeches. Religion was out in the open. A Seloran registrar managed the village ledgers. She was a quiet woman who wore white cords on her sleeves and spoke like a tidal pool. Calm, deep, and hard to move. The Varaki temple was at the brink of the cliff, and fishermen attached their offerings to a red-painted beam before going into the black water. Neris held meetings were placed at dusk, when the blue moon blurred the horizon and someone took out a flute and started playing. No one in the village fought about what they believed since they needed each other to survive. People argued for harvest halls in bigger cities. Further from the edge of the cliff, there were rope nets for walls in the school's high room. Dama, the instructor, wore all 3 of her bracelets, white, red, and blue, to keep the peace. She would say to the students, "You all have the moons. Nobody gets to leave one out just because it doesn't feel like you." She taught reading by carving stories into driftwood and giving the boards to the kids. She taught counting by using shells that sounded like rain when they hit each other. She taught the sea by taking the kids to the low platform and letting them feel safe when they were scared. She would reply, "Respect is a rope. Attach it to everything." Aaron liked the shell puzzles and the old stories, but what he liked most were the tide boards. They were enormous boards with charcoal lines on them that showed where the low and high windows were. Every week the lines moved forward a little bit. Sometimes they went too far, and other times they didn't go far enough. The village council met and fought about how many fish they could catch and how much rope they could use, but they paid the greatest attention when Dama pointed at the boards. She didn't say anything about orbits or gravity. She talked about indicators like, Selora's clean face and Varak's tilt mean 2 high waves by dusk, or Neris is smudged, We give the lower steps to the children today. It was wisdom passed down through the ages. It worked often enough to be trusted, but it also failed often enough to keep everyone humble. Festivals were made to be put together quickly and taken down even faster. During the 3-night when all the moons were out, there were lanterns strung between poles, strong sweet tea cooked, and a dance on the springiest pathway that made the whole hamlet seem to jump. Instead of rings, lovers exchanged knots, a loop made from each person's climbing rope, tied together and sealed with a drop of wax. Vows said, "I tie you to my safe places," not "I make you whole." No one vowed to be together forever. They promised to rebuild when the sea took anything. People stayed married not because they were afraid of breaking a promise, but because they remembered the day they worked together to fix a floor. The work followed the moons. When Selora's light made the surface look like a page, the fishers went out. Under Neris, harvesters went for kelp and hinge shells, trusting her gentle blue to keep them quiet. The forges lit up under Varak. They were small forges because big fires fed storms. The cliffsmiths fixed hooks, straightened nails, and tempered the ironwood plates that made ladders strong. Kids started working as apprentices early on, and no one made fun of them for it. If a singer's song calmed people down, they could save a crowd faster than a rope. A rope maker could mean the difference between a good fall and a funeral. People who traveled told others about different ways to live. In the north, a city hung from a mountain, with terraces that seemed like steps to the sky. Selora's laws were engraved into white stone. In the east, war barges with iron rams on their bows went under Varak. The crews were proud and laughed at cliffs. Some individuals in the south have moved completely under the water. When they got to shore, they donned glass shells on their heads and spoke slowly. The village women were worried since their kids were pale and curious and didn't know how to be afraid of ladders. Arin listened with wide eyes and a tummy that constricted with want. He liked his cliff, but the world outside pulled at him like a wave. There were other people also. That year, the community looked to be full with desire. Mira, who could fix nets with her fingers as fast as fish, wanted a longer song. Hen, who turned scrap metal into nails, requested to inspect the ledgers of the mountain city. Dama even stopped in the middle of a lecture to stare at the triangle of moons with a look that showed she was counting more than just shells. Then the horn changed. It didn't sing in a high or low voice. It stammered. People didn't talk about the stammer since that would have made it genuine. But that morning, the note broke in the middle of a breath. People got up too quickly. A basket toppled down. A pot fell. Dama's grip on the child's shoulder got tighter. Jaro, who had been playing the horn for a long time before Arin was born, took it out of his mouth and stared out at the sea. The line of sight was improper. It went up in a straight line instead of a curve. The white moon was big and round in the west. The red moon was low and mean in the south. And the blue moon was thin and smeared like breath on glass. 3 separate pulls, 3 different promises, and all of them are fighting. "Up," said Dama. No yelling, no drama, a word that everyone knew. People climbed, clipped, and grabbed kids. The ropes creaked, the poles bent, and the chambers below breathed out as if they were ready for the sea to flood them and wanted to make place. The first wave crashed into the rocks with a loud noise and shattered into spray. Not a beast, not yet. People stayed short. Arin's heart raced and then calmed down. He had rowed worse. The second wave didn't make a sound. It thudded, like the waves had decided to hit instead of yell. The lower rooms were half full. Nets swam into kitchens and out the other side with knives still stuck in them. Someone's stool floated by upside down like a small boat that had lost its owner. The third wave was different. It turned. It crawled up the cliff and over the edge. The walkways bent, then raised, and then snapped back into place. One of the neighbors' lines broke, and 3 people grabbed it before the guy fell. Nobody yelled. Screaming was a waste of breath. Then, in the blink of an eye, the water was gone. It rushed away so far that the dark rocks below appeared like teeth. Fish flopped around in pockets. A little octopus waved something that could have been an insult. People stayed clipped. Everyone thought the empty sea was untrustworthy. Dama said, "Look at the moons." "Don't move until Selora clears the old mast." Arin raised his head. Selora took her time getting to the place Dama had told her about. She was slow, patient, and almost empathetic. Varak was angrier, low, red, and pulsing. And Neris hazed the whole thing with a feeling like a dream you forget the instant you try to describe it. Dama nodded when Selora got to the mast scar. People let go of their lines. Arin unclipped, his legs shaking in that nice manner that indicates you're still here. Finally, old Jaro let out the air he had been holding and lowered the horn. Later, When the market had come back together like a joke told twice and the kids started counting fish in the puddles below, Aaron stood on the tallest platform and watched the sea pretend to be quiet again. He felt the need come back stronger. Not to get away, not really, to get it. To look the triple sky in the face and declare, I see you, and I will not only survive you, I will live. Dama's voice came from behind him. You're thinking with all 3 moons again. Is that a bad thing? It's heavy, she said. So put a belt on it, he smiled. In reality 91, that was a good thing. In reality 91, the moons were more than just lights in the sky. People believed they were true, and their pull was stronger than the water. By the time Aaron was a boy, whole societies had formed around each moon. Their beliefs were related to the tides as much as the rhythms of belief. The white moon, Selora, was the most organized. Her disciples wore light strings around their wrists or necks to remind them to be patient and organized. The Seloran communities looked neat and tidy, with dwellings lined up in rows even when the cliff curved. Their leaders were in charge of keeping records and making laws. A Seloran believed that survival didn't depend on strength or luck, but on laws that were followed again and over again. Like boats crossing the same safe channel. They taught their kids to write early, keep journals, and measure things meticulously. People in Seloran halls cherished silence, not because they were afraid, but because it was a form of discipline. The red moon Varak brought together the furious. People painted their doors in shades of rust and scarlet, and festivities under her light were raucous with drums and smoke. The Varaki chose to live close to danger. They made their pathways lower, closer to the water, and dared the waves to hit them. They erected stronger dwellings after the storm destroyed theirs, bragging about what they had lost as proof of their bravery. By the time they were 10, kids were told to climb without hooks and to fall and get back up without being ashamed. It wasn't the law that chose a Varaki leader. It was who could dive the longest, carry the biggest rope, and endure the worst storm without flinching. Risk was prayer, and strength was proof. The dreamers owned Neris, the blue moon. Her folks put shells in their windows so the wind could sing through them. They said the sound was Neris whispering. They loved signs and symbols, and they saw omens in the way birds flew and the way waves moved. They recounted stories that never ended the same way twice. Their communities looked like collages, with walls painted with weird pictures of moons, fish and stars, and nets hanging with trinkets. It seemed like a mess to anyone who weren't there, but to them it was beautiful. A Nerisan child was told to explore, listen, and come up with new ideas. A Nerisan leader was more likely to be a musician or a seer than a fighter. With flutes and masks, their festivities under the blue glow went on until late at night. The whole cliff appeared like a dream you could stroll through. These 3 styles of life lived together, but not for long in peace. The Selorans thought the Varaki were careless, and the Nerisan were immature. Varaki made fun of Selorans for being weak and called the Nerisan cowards. Nerisan singers fabricated stories about the other 2, turning them into villains or fools to make people laugh. It was a fight that had been going on for a long time, and yet they were dependent on each other. Selorans kept the books that made trade possible. Varaki ships ferried things through the treacherous waves. Nerisan melodies transmitted word across villages faster than horns could. Without one religion, the others would die of hunger or drown. So they lived in a shaky equilibrium, often fighting and being tied up. Like many other villages, Aaron's was a mix. His mother sung Nerisan melodies. His father made Varaki knots, and Seloran, the registrant who taught him to read, was his teacher. People at festivals made sure to include all 3 colors of lanterns, white, red, and blue. Aaron could still feel the tension behind the grins. Old men fought about which moon pushed the waves the hardest. The kids murmured that the other kids were wrong, and that their parents knew the truth all along. One night, a festival demonstrated how weak it was. Selora was almost full, and the light was intense enough to make shadows look crisp. Varak flared low to the south, its color like blood. Neris floated in the haze like a phantom. People gathered on the upper walkways, the lanterns swaying and the music commencing. A Seloran speaker started with a peaceful prayer, praising Selora for her order. A Varaki fisherman yelled out, holding up a crimson cup and saying that Varak had spared his boat that morning. The Nerisan flutist chuckled and said that Neris had led his nets to a secret cove. Voices got louder. Shouts morphed into jeers, and soon the walkway shook not from music but from people stomping in anger. It could have resulted in a fight if the tide horn hadn't gone off. At that moment, the sea chose to remind everyone who was in charge. The horizon rose in a dark swell, and terror made the crowd go back to their ropes and hooks. Arguments spread out like fish. No one went back to fighting once the wave went by. People went home without saying a word, leaving the lanterns to burn out on their own. Aaron never forgot that night. At that point, he understood that the moons were more than just lights. They were like mirrors that showed how individuals felt, peaceful, angry, or dreaming. And people would always pick a side. He also watched how fast such sides could fall apart when the sea demanded respect. In Reality 91, faith was important, but the water had the final say. And under 3 moons, people learned to live apart but still be connected by the same ropes. Aaron watched as his environment grew taller throughout the years. His town had always been built on stilts and walkways, but now whole areas were doing the same. The coastline was no longer populated with small groups of residences. Instead, it was topped by cities on the edge, with huge wooden and iron buildings towering like forests over the sea. People had learnt to quit fighting the moon's violence and instead climb higher than it could reach. The big city of Highmarsh became the model. It was built where 3 rivers intersected and rose layer after tier on platforms that were pushed deep into the rock. The lowest decks were meant to be sacrificed so they could be drowned and rebuilt. The higher decks were spacious and strong, and these were where markets, schools, and temples were. The city rocked back and forth when the waves hit, but it never fell. Traders named it the Floating Mountain, but its base was buried like roots. When Aaron was a young man, he went there and was amazed by what he saw. Towers made of wood and rope, decorated with beautiful sails to catch the wind, and bridges that crossed water so far below that it looked like a second sky. Things were different in those cities. People didn't fear the sea with every breath anymore. They giggled as storms hit the lower decks and froth rose between the slats. Kids raced across suspension bridges that would scare those who weren't from there. Priests painted their shrines on the topmost beams and said that their moon had made this victory possible. Walking on the decks of Highmarsh made you feel both weak and strong, like being on a ship that could never sink. Still, the old distinctions were still there. Selora and registrars kept the ledgers in pristine white hallways on one platform. They wrote down every trade in ink that was as pale as their cords. On the other hand, Varaki guilds taught young men and women how to fight by throwing them into the storm spray to show how brave they were. In the secret lanes, Neris and dreamers painted moons and fish on the walls and told anyone who would listen their weird stories. The city was a gorgeous, intense tapestry. Aaron wandered around and learned from them all. He liked how organized Seloran was, but he didn't like how they looked down on the others. He admired Varaki's power, but he knew that it could sometimes be harsh. He enjoyed the legends of Nerisan, but he got upset when they didn't talk about hunger and danger and instead focused on visions. He still knew that they all worked together to keep the city alive. Highmarsh would fall apart without order. It would be taken if it weren't strong. It would never grow without creativity. Other cities also grew. Cliffspire was erected right against a sheer wall, and the dwellings were carved into the stone like swallows' nests. Deep Reach, a Nerisan building that is half submerged, with its domes shining slightly blue below the surface. Varak's Teeth is a city of war made up of iron barges tied together with red flags. It looks more like a moving fortress than a habitation. Each one mirrored the philosophy of its moon and dared the tides in its own way. Everything changed when they started trading with each other. Survival was no longer only local. Highmarsh traded ropes for Cliffspire's stone tools. Deep Reach traded iron from Varak's Teeth for kelp cures. Sailors who sailed from city to city carried songs faster than goods. They sang in different languages and made up stories about 3 moons in one chorus. But trading caused problems. Who had the most power over the markets? Who started the festivals with their rituals? Which moon really blessed the safe passage? These questions provoked fights that were worse than knives. Aaron often listened in the markets. A Seloran clerk said that trade would fall apart without written contracts. A Varaki captain slammed her fist and said that only strength kept ships alive. A Nerisan singer made fun of them both and said, "Your ledgers burn, your fists rot, but our stories stay in the heart." People still lived together, though. They had to. It didn't matter what colors you wore on your cords when storms came and the waves hit. The waves would swallow everything. That reality kept them together, but just barely. Aaron got a job as a teacher in Highmarsh. He didn't belong to one religion, which made everyone suspicious of him yet valuable to many. He taught them how to interpret driftwood sculptures, measure tides, climb properly, and sing when they were scared. Some parents were not happy with his lessons since they blended all 3 moons, but the kids paid attention. They loved that he didn't tell them which moon controlled them. Instead, he informed them that each moon talked in a different way and that it was their job to listen. One night, while Selora was shining down on him, he walked the high deck and observed a Nerisan girl painting blue spirals on the boards. A clerk from Selora yelled at her, saying she messed up the order. A Varaki boy stepped in and told the clerk to stop. The conversation got very heated until Aaron stepped in. He said, "In a week, the planks will wash away. There won't be any paint left. The girl will remember that you yelled, while the boy will remember that you battled. Which lasts longer?" The clerk seemed unhappy. The boy smiled. The girl kept on painting. Aaron finally understood that the moons weren't the issue. People's need to pick one over the others disrupted the peace. The 3 moons watched in stillness from high above. Selora was white and patient. Varak was red and blazing, and Neris was blue and hard to find. And Aaron thought about what kind of city people might make if they all listened to all 3 at the same time. By the time Aaron was 30, the cities were strong enough to think about more than just staying alive. They weren't merely hanging onto rocks or floating on beams above the waters anymore. They were starting to fantasize of ruling, of building an empire, and of bringing the world together into one voice instead of 3. It started in Cliffspire, the Seloran fortress that was carved out of stone. Their clerics talked about bringing order and rule across the seas. They instructed their people, "The moons argue in the sky, but we must not argue here on Earth. We have to pick one voice and one way, or the sea will split us up for good." Cliffspire said it was the heart of a new union called the League of Selora, and invited all other cities to join and follow its rules and books. Some people did. Smaller villages, sick of the mayhem, put their lives in the hands of Seloran order. They signed contracts, etched documents into stone tablets, and vowed on Selora's pallid face that they would follow the League. The market settled down. For the first time, ships sailed with agreed-upon schedules, so they could meet in the same ports without any problems. It felt like tranquility, but not everyone did bow. The League's rules made Varak's teeth giggle. Their captains flew red flags higher than before and said, "Ink can't tame the sea. Courage is the only thing that matters here." They attacked League ships, stealing supplies, destroying records, and daring Selora's followers to come battle them. They didn't see the League as a sign of strength. They regarded it as a sign of weakness. They thought that strength meant freedom, and nothing could hold them back. The Nerisan cities fought back in a different way, but they were softer. Deep Reach sent messengers to Cliffspire to declare, "The sea is not a ledger. It is a mystery. It's not owned by anyone." They wouldn't sign anything, but they did give songs and alliances forged only by word. Seloran thought this was stupid. It was freedom for Nerisan hearts. The League got bigger, but it also got more foes. Aaron, who is now a teacher and sometimes advisor in Highmarsh, observed with worry. His city was in the middle of everything. Seloran clerks controlled the markets, Varaki guilds protected the lower decks, and Nerisan singers filled the festivals. Joining one side would mean splitting the city. The council fought for weeks, with papers flying, fists slamming, and songs making fun of them. They finally decided to stay neutral, but neutrality is weak when the world starts to get ready for war. The first real fight happened at sea. A League convoy traveled with stone tablets that said who owned the trade routes. At dawn, a Varaki war barge hit them, ripping the forward ship apart with an iron ram. People who survived were put on the barge, tied up and made fun of. Your ledgers can't save you from the waves. The League sent warriors in armor, with pale ropes tied tightly around their arms. Fights broke out all over, starting small but getting big enough to ruin every harbor. Aaron could tell that his students had changed. They whispered about whose moon they belonged to, not as a joke but as a way to separate them. People started fighting on the walkways. A boy with red paint on his cord pushed a female who was wearing white. Someone else spat on a Neris and shell charm. The moons tugged on the teachers too, so they couldn't stop it. Even kids could tell that the globe was tipping. Festivals turned, becoming deadly events. Once all 3 moons were revered, but now colors were taken down. Red and blue decorations disappeared in Seloran quarters. In Varaki decks, pale ropes were cut off of wrists. People in Nerisan alleys made fun of singers who said they were liars. But there were still those advocating for unity. Some Selorans said that Varak and Neris could come in if they bowed. Some Varaki captains said that Seloran law was better for getting loot than chaos. A few Nerisan dreamers shared stories about a prophecy that said the day the moons would line up and people would have to stand together. Aaron was interested in these talks. People respected his instruction and the fact that he wouldn't select sides. He talked at markets and said, "Look at your homes. Seloran legislation keeps your business going. Varaki strength protects your ships. Nerisan vision gives you music to help you go through the fear. You all need each other to live. Why should the world?" Some people listened. A lot of people turned away. Not many people wanted to give in while their pride was so high. Cliffspire's demand for tribute was the last straw. They told Highmarsh, "You must join the League if you want to be safe from Varaki raids." The council fought for days. Someone asked Aaron to speak. He stepped in front of them and said, "If we bow, we betray half of our people. If we say no, we could get burned. But maybe we can hold on if we create bridges instead of walls." His remarks bought him time. Highmarsh stayed neutral, but the League got stronger. Varak's teeth sharpened their rams, and Neris cities talked more about omens. Aaron stood on the upper deck one night and looked up at the sky. The three moons were in a peculiar order. Selora was calm above, Varak was low and flaming, and Neris was pale and soft. He wondered if they fought with each other like their people did down below. He was curious if they cared. The sea spoke first, then the sky. A storm came up out of nowhere and hit the lower decks hard. The walkways broke, the ropes broke, and people yelled. And when Aaron cut his rope and pulled a youngster to safety, he remembered what he had always known. Selora, Varak, and Neris were not the actual enemies. It was the water they disturbed, the never-ending tide that didn't care about faith or law. But try telling the cities that. The first unification had started, and it would not finish in peace. When the conflicts of the moon spilled to the oceans, a lot of people were tired of picking sides. Selora's laws, Varak's might, and Neris's visions didn't stop the tides. Battles destroyed ships and killed sailors, but the water always took more than any enemy. Families lost their homes not to soldiers, but to waves that came out of nowhere. Some people started to say, if we can't control the sea, maybe we should live in it. The Neris cities were the first to turn that murmur into action. Their dreamers had always looked down into the abyss and imagined worlds below. Some divers stayed longer than others, and some sung of shadows going far below the blue light. As the wars got worse and the raids kept happening, these people found the strength to stand up. They made glass shells, which were rough at first and looked like domes worn on the head with pipes coming from the surface. There were a lot of accidents, but Neris's determination didn't care about failure. Every failed effort was a new story, and every person who survived was a prophet of what could happen. During these years, Aaron went to Deep Reach to see what the whispers were about. He thought there would be weird stories and weak machines. What he found shocked him. A group of domes below the waterline sparkled slightly with trapped air and were held in place by stone and rope. Families went inside and their voices were quiet yet peaceful. Kids laughed as they rubbed their faces to the window and watched fish swim by. For the first time, people weren't just going against the water. They were living in it. Underwater life was different. People moved slowly, talked little, and learned to read gestures instead of words. The food was simple. Kelp, shellfish, and weird pale crops that grew in pockets of earth below. Light was precious coming through Neris's blue glow. At night inside the domes it felt like living in a dream. Shadows moved across faces and the water whispered outside. For the Neris faithful, it was confirmation that their goddess had blessed them. They said, "Neris has always called us to the deep. Now we respond." Not all of them were accepted. Seloran officials made fun of the domes, saying they were useless for keeping records or order. They inquired, "How do you keep a ledger where ink melts?" "You hide in the water because you can't face the storm above," Varaki captains said. But over time, curiosity won out over disdain. Traders knew that Deep Reach could get kelp and pearls that no one else could. Healers discovered that plants that grew in the dark might treat diseases. Even people who didn't believe in the depths started to realize their worth. Aaron stayed for weeks and taught kids in one of the bigger domes. He understood their rhythm, how they tapped on glass to call neighbors, how they sang low tunes to calm their worries when storms rattled the anchors, and how they painted shells and put them outside as markers for divers who were coming back. He felt at peace there in a way he hadn't in Highmarsh or Cliffspire. The water was no longer just an opponent. It had become a roof, a shield, and a strange kind of home. But peace was not strong. The League of Selora thought the domes were a sign of defiance. They sent messengers to ask for tribute. They informed the Neris leaders, "You can't live outside the law. Join the League or your domes will be broken." Deep Reach said no, but in a nice way. Instead of contracts, they sent back tunes. "We are already bound," they sung. Bound to the tide. The Varaki saw something else, a chance. They attacked domes from above, cutting off supply pipes and making the people who lived underwater pay for repairs. But this didn't shatter them either. Neris divers made their pipes stronger, anchored them deeper and disguised them so raiders couldn't discover them. The Varaki made fun of them, but they started to be afraid. "How could you combat an enemy who lived in the water you sailed?" Aaron understood that things would never be the same again. People were no longer just hanging onto rocks or climbing on stilts. It was extending into 3 areas: the heights, the oceans, and the depths. Each one was like a moon. Selora in the order of cities above, Varak in the daring of ships on the surface, and Neris in the dream of domes below. Aaron sat with a group of divers one night while Neris gleamed faintly blue across the sea. They told him about the sea's voice, which sounded like a drum beating on their ears all the time, and how dreams seemed to last longer when they were underwater. One diver said softly, "I dreamed that the 3 moons met under the sea and their light crossed, turning the water into fire. I thought when I woke up, maybe the world is waiting for us to join, not fight." Aaron took those words back to Highmarsh, feeling sad but hopeful. He has seen kids laugh under a glass dome while storms raged outside. He had seen faith blossom into life. There was no way for a council or army to stop the world from changing. He was still scared of what would happen next. Reality 91 was full with both awe and danger at every turn. And as the domes of Deep Reach got bigger, the Varaki polished their blades, and the Selorans wrote larger ledgers. Aaron knew the moons were watching. Selora with patience, fire with Varak. Neris is a mystery, and one day, maybe they might charge a premium for living under all 3. People stopped merely looking at the water and the cliffs one day. They started to look up, past the clouds and storms, into the dark night where 3 moons maintained watch. For a long time, those spheres have been gods, guides, curses, and friends. People asked the most alarming question of all: what if we could reach them? Their towns were safe on stilts and domes, and trade was flowing between them. It wasn't Cliffspire's ledgers or Varak's warships that started the age of astronomy. It was the quiet observatories of Highmarsh. A group of scholars had built platforms above the topmost decks by putting polished stones into frames made of wood and glass. They pointed them at the moons, which caught light and made it bigger. For the first time, they could see the surface of their protectors, which had mountains, valleys, scars, and craters. The moons were no longer smooth portraits created by gods. They were real places. Word got out fast. Seloran priests tightened their hold and said that Selora's surface demonstrated how perfect her law was. Varaki commanders yelled that Varak's scars showed how many wars she had fought. Neris and singers said in hushed tones that Neris's shadows were dreams turned to stone. The traditional divisions grew stronger, but something else was going on underneath. Curiosity. Kids looked through cheap telescopes and inquired, "If these are worlds, why don't we go there?" People who traded pondered if the moons had metals, water, or crops that no one could imagine. Soldiers even conceived of the moons as strongholds in the sky from which they could command all the seas. Erin, who was now a powerful man, became caught up in this hurricane of ideas. He went to the observatories a lot and stared until his eyes hurt. He had always known that the moons shaped people. Now he knew that others might one day shape them. Deep Reach made the first real breakthrough. The Neris divers, who were used to erecting domes and dealing with pressure, turned their talents up. They made sealed rooms out of glass and metal, first to dive deeper and subsequently to hold air on high platforms. They said, "If we can live under the sea, we can live in the sky." Their experiments were sloppy, and many of them ended in explosions of broken glass. But the dream did not end. Soon, Seloran engineers joined, adding accuracy. They built towering structures with angles that were meticulously calibrated. Then they sent weighted kites into the sky to see how strong the wind was. They talked about equilibrium and laws that ruled not just the oceans but even the stars. Their recordings were the basis for a new field of study. At first, the Varaki laughed. They said it was foolish to chase the moons when the sea still killed more men than storms of fire. But their pride wouldn't let them lose. Their blacksmiths soon made the first rockets, which were just iron tubes filled with gunpowder that went up in loud blasts. Most of them went back in flames and crashed into the ocean. But the Varaki yelled with glee because even failure smelt like smoke and bravery. This combination of vision, law, and strength helped people rise. Platforms rose above the skies, held in place by ropes as thick as trees. Astronomers were able to measure the moon's movements more accurately than ever before at these heights. They started to guess when storms, tides, and even eclipses would happen. For the first time, people didn't just react to the water. They planned for it. This gave them power, and with power came desire. Each religion wanted to be the first to reach its moon. Selora's League said that the White Moon had to be the site of humanity's first colony, which proved her order. Varak's captains promised that their troops would put up flags on the Red Moon and call it their people's forge. Neris and singers wanted to touch Neris because they thought that visions there would change the souls of all people. High Marsh was once again in the middle. Because it was impartial, it was the best place for people to meet. Scholars from all over the world arrived, bringing bits of information, tools, and prototypes that weren't quite right. The machinery that shook, smoked, and sometimes blew up were too heavy for the city's decks. Kids applauded when sparks lighted up the night sky. They shouted the names of moons as each attempt went up in flames and died. Aaron, whose beard was already gray at the ends, strolled among them with a mix of fear and amazement. He saw wonder in the eyes of young people, but he also saw the same division he had witnessed since he was a child. He warned one gathering of scholars, "You can't reach the sky if you bring old arguments with you." They chuckled pleasantly, but he knew they didn't hear the warning. The first success was tiny. A Selora tower shot a fire tube that didn't fall back right away. It went up high, into the clouds, and for a time everyone in High Marsh thought it had reached the stars. Even though it fell back and hit the sea far away, the League nonetheless called it a triumph. They said, Selora's law carried it. A Varaki crew soon took control of a rocket that contained a little bronze sphere. It landed safely in the waters, and they acted like they had conquered the moons themselves. Neris and dreamers wrote songs about the occurrence, saying, "The sphere sang when it fell. It whispered of Neris." The fact was less grand. They had merely touched the edge of the sky. But the concept had taken hold too firmly. There was no going back now. Now that RN students are adults, they came to him with inquiries. One person questioned, "Teacher, what if we get there and find God's waiting? What if Selora talks, Varak asks for tribute, or Neris eats us all?" Aaron shook his head. "And what if we only find stone?" The student seemed unhappy. "Wouldn't that make everything smaller?" Aaron put a hand on his shoulder. "No, it would make us bigger." The trials got bolder in the years that followed. Capsules replaced domes. Fire tubes turned into spear-shaped rockets. People died, burned, broke, or drowned. But they kept climbing. The moons watched as they always do, their pull steady and their mystery never-ending. There was nothing easy about the age of astronomy. It was a race, a game, and a bet with fire. But with every launch, every damaged machine, and every dream emblazoned across the sky, people showed that they were no longer happy to be dominated exclusively by the sea and the moonlight. They wanted to be with them. Reality 91 was on its way up, no matter what the moons thought of it. Long before people got to the moons, the sky had become a battlefield. What started as tests, rockets that broke and burned, domes that shook and hissed, quickly became weapons. If a fire tube could lift a bronze sphere, why couldn't it lift a stone filled with powder that could fall on an enemy fleet? If one city could use its telescopes to forecast the tides, then why not utilize that information to plan an attack and hit the enemy's ports when the sea overwhelmed them? The beauty of astronomy turned into a new type of battle. The League of Selora was the first to act. From Cliffspire, they shot things down, not at the moons, but at the waters. Their engineers had figured out how to make cliffs fall in a controlled way, which caused landslides to hit Varaki ports. It was a law written in stone that they dubbed Selora's Judgment. The damage was awful. Ships crashed into tumbling rocks and markets were flooded all of a sudden. The League said it was confirmation that Selora had selected them to be in charge. The Varaki responded with fire. Their warships had new engines and iron tubes that shot flaming bolts over the water. These bolts didn't go very far, but when they hit, they tore holes in stilts and platforms, making towns shake and scream above the seas. As they set sail, the Varaki captains laughed as the sails glowed crimson in the moonlight. "Varak fights with us," they said, "and she never misses." The Neris cities, which were not as warlike but just as smart, found another way. They learned how to control the tides on their own. They made huge drums and resonating horns under their domes by looking at how the moons lined up. When they were sounded, they disturbed the waters at just the right times, turning natural surges into waves that hit enemy coasts. They responded, "The sea is our choir. We only tell it what to sing." Their attacks were quiet, with no fire or stones, but whole Varaki harbors disappeared behind walls of water that were raised by unknown hands. The war spread like a disease. Villages that didn't want to be a part of it were lured in by how close they were. A city that didn't want to join either side was stuck in the middle, with Varaki raiders burning its ships and Seloran clerks taxing its marketplaces. Being neutral was no longer safe. Even High Marsh, which had always been fair to all religions, felt its decks shake beneath the weight of split loyalties. Aaron, who was older now but not broken, watched the world fall apart. His classmates had become soldiers, blacksmiths, and singers. Many of them said that the war was their destiny. He tried to tell them. He said, "The sea has always been our enemy. Don't make things worse than they are." But battle has its own weight, which is stronger than any moon. Not many people listened. The fights weren't like the old ones with arrows and rams. They were disasters. When Selora's league hit Varak's teeth, they knocked down cliffs on whole fleets. When Varaki war barges hit the docks at Cliffspire, the stilts burnt until the city above slanted like a shattered mast. When the Neris horns blew, the whole shore shook and the waves ate up farmland. The moons themselves seemed to shine brighter during these nights of destruction, as if they were angry or happy. High Marsh was the final place where people could come together in peace. Refugees came in droves. Seloran families carrying ledgers that had been soaked in seawater, Varaki soldiers with broken arms, and Neris singers whose domes had cracked. The council tried to keep things calm, but there was a lot of tension in the air. People started fighting in the markets. The kids sang different hymns at the same time and their voices clashed. The city didn't wobble because of waves. It shook because of separation. One night, Aaron stepped on the top deck and looked at the three moons. Selora was full, bright, and cold. Varak was burning low and crimson. Neris glimmered faintly with a blue mist over them both. He thought about if they cared what their kids were doing down there. He thought that maybe the war wasn't between people but between the moons themselves, with people fighting for them. The Battle of the Triple Tide occurred next. It was the biggest fight anyone could remember. Selora's league sent out their biggest fleet, with sails as white as bone and engines that could drop burning stones on Varaki ships. The captains of Varak responded with fire barges that roared forward with iron tubes ready to spit fire. And the Neresan domes, which were concealed under the waters, got their horns ready to change the tide. All three powers hit at the same time. What happened was beyond belief. Stones dropped from the heavens and broke ships apart. Firebolts lit up the night and set sails on fire. The sea shook with horns, making waves that were higher than temples. The ocean screamed for 3 nights. People who survived reported it felt like the moons were fighting above them, dragging at the water like claws. There was no winner when it was over. Only wreckage, burning barges, broken stilts, submerged markets, and bodies floating in the foam. The Great Tides War was at its height. But instead of stopping, it got worse. Smaller cities made their own weapons by duplicating what they could and attacking their neighbors out of fear. Families that used to work together in commerce turned against each other. It seemed like songs turned into war chants, laws turned into orders, and bravery turned into ruthlessness. But even in the smoke and salt, some voices still talked of another way. People who had lost their houses started to doubt the beliefs that had kept them going. Kids wanted to know why the moons allowed the waves eat their people if they loved them. Not warriors or priests, but regular people started to congregate in secret places in High Marsh and Deep Reach. They didn't talk about winning or taking over. They talked about staying alive and having peace. Aaron felt pulled to them. He had taught too many kids who were now dead and buried at sea. He had seen too many towns burn for the sake of the moons. He didn't carry a banner, wear a cord, or sing a song, but he started to believe in something else. That one day, the people of Reality 91 may perceive the moons not as gods or enemies, but as planets that needed to be touched together. But for now, the conflict went on. Reality 91 slid deeper into a tempest of its own making with each flood, each fire, and each fall of stone. The conflict had broken Reality 91 into pieces, but no one was ready for what the skies would deliver. For a long time, tales had said that there will be a time when the 3 moons would meet and overlap in a terrible way. Some people named it the Fist of the Gods, while others termed it the Silent Eclipse. Neresan musicians sang it as a prophecy, Seloran priests wrote it as a warning, and Varaki captains said it was just a superstition. But the day came, and no one could dispute what they witnessed. At first, all was silent. Selora, who was white and peaceful, got up early that night. Varak, dark red and angry, came next, climbing low across the horizon. Neris shone softly and floated higher than either of them. For months, the observatories in High Marsh had been keeping note of this, writing furiously in ledgers and warning councils that the alignment was true. Not many people listened. Leaders were too busy counting fleets and honing armaments. Aaron paid attention. He often stood on the upper deck with his students and pointed to the sky. He stated, "The world will change when they meet. The sea will feel all 3 pulls at the same time. What has always been violent will become too much to bear." A lot of people nodded, but what could they do? Where could they go? There were only ocean and cliffs in the globe, and no city was beyond the moon's reach. The moons got closer as the night went on. At first, Selora and Varak overlapped, and their white and red colors twisted into a faint scarlet disk. The sea below was restless. Even though there was no wind, the fishermen tied their boats higher on the rocks, their hands shaking. Then Neris floated over them, her light blue halo casting a shadow over the others. The world got darker for the first time in a long time. The silent eclipse had begun. At first, many were amazed. People gathered on walkways and domes to watch the three moons lock into one shaking mass. Priests said things that would happen, singers sang loudly, and captains yelled challenges to the skies. Then the sea roared. It didn't sound like a storm. It sounded like the planet was breaking apart. Waves didn't rise in a steady pace. They crashed into each other from all sides at once. High marsh swayed, and the stilts creaked as the water rose over them. The carved halls of Cliffspire rocked, and pieces of stone fell into the void. Varak's teeth, the most daring of them, fell apart as barges crashed into one another. Their anchors were no match for the waves. The domes of Deep Reach shook, and the glass strained as the currents twisted them like toys. The eclipse changed day into a bizarre twilight, with shadows getting longer and colors fading from the world. There was a peculiar bruise on the surface of the sea that made it look blue and crimson. Without storm clouds, lightning struck and bolts jumped from the sea to the sky, as if the air couldn't take it anymore. Aaron held onto the upper deck and pulled the kids close. People around him prayed to all three moons at once, begging for compassion. The priests of Selora tried to chant, but the noise made it impossible for them to hear. The Varaki warriors yelled no and hit the railings with their weapons. The wind ripped the flutes from the hands of the Neris singers, who cried. And suddenly there was silence. For one unimaginable instant, the waves stopped rising, the wind stopped blowing, and the groaning of the stilts halted. Everyone in the globe held their breath. People blinked with disbelief. They couldn't hear anything, not the water, the horns, or even their own voices. The mouths moved, but no sound came forth. It was as if the moons had taken the air itself. That's why they named it the silent eclipse. When the sound came back, it was angry. The ocean slammed all at once, and the waves hit each other like mountains hitting each other. All of the walkways broke. The towers were leaning. Domes broke. The sea took thousands of people away. The shouts got louder than thunder, breaking the silence that had briefly taken them in. High Marsh lived, but he was hurt. Its markets were flooded, half of its decks were ripped off, and its people were broken. Cliffspire lost whole levels of stone, which fell into the sea below. The water had broken up Varak's teeth, which was no longer a fortification. Deep Reach barely survived. Many domes broke, but a few stayed up, glimmering faintly like stars underwater. When daylight finally came, the moons had separated and were moving back to their individual courses. But the world they left behind was completely different. The coastlines had changed. Islands were gone. New ones had grown, harsh and jagged. Families were gone, and whole religions were disturbed. After then, something unusual happened. People stopped arguing about whose moon ruled for the first time. Seloran priests stopped talking when their temples broke apart. Varaki commanders put down their weapons to bury their dead after their ships broke. Neris singers no longer sung about predictions coming true. Instead, they sang about how sad they were about the people who had died. Aaron wandered among the survivors, helping them rebuild and teaching the kids how to be brave in the stillness. Maybe the moons don't bless or curse us, he heard others say. Maybe they just are. People who had once struggled for power now shared lunch without inquiring who wore what. Reality 91 tasted unity for a short while, but Aaron knew it wouldn't last. People were stubborn. Pride had been around for a long time. He knew something more, though. The silent eclipse had planted a seed, a recall of how it felt when every voice, city, and faith went quiet at the same time. A recollection of quiet that could one day turn into tranquility. The moons had proved how strong they were. The citizens of Reality 91 had barely made it through. It was no longer a matter of whether the moons were gods or adversaries. The question was whether people could learn from the silence, or whether they would slip back into the same noise that had always kept them apart. Aaron looked up at the sky, where three moons were moving away from each other. He whispered, not to Selora, Varak, or Neris, but to the quiet itself. "Show us," he said, "before we ruin everything." The world was not the same after the silent eclipse. Reality 91 was hurt. Its cities were in ruins, and its inhabitants were thin from loss. The sea had taken so much that even the most tenacious warrior or priest could not pretend things were the same. For the first time in hundreds of years, there was silence. It wasn't because of the moons. It was because people were too tired to fight. High Marsh became a safe place. Refugees came in from ruined vessels, fallen cliffs, shattered domes. The decks sagged under their weight, which was held up by whatever wood and rope they could find. Markets used to shout in 3 voices, but now they whisper in many languages, more quietly and slowly. People gave each other food without asking what color cord the giver wore. A Varaki boy and a Seloran child held hands while they each carried buckets of water. A Neris singer played quietly to comfort the scared, not to proclaim prophecy. The League of Selora still endeavored to enforce its regulations, but its records and ledgers had been lost at sea. There were no contracts or rules that the priests could point to. Varaki captains still yelled orders, but their threats were empty without fleets. Neris singers still told stories, but their songs were darker and they weren't as sure of themselves. The moons had made them all feel small. Aaron strolled across High Marsh with eyes that saw both hope and misery. His hair was streaked with gray, his body was slower, but his mind was sharper than ever. He thought back to the night when everything was quiet, even the waves. He kept that memory alive like a flame, a sign of what could happen. There were meetings, not just for priests and soldiers, but for survivors as well. They met in rooms with cracked walls, sat on crates and talked honestly, even if they were fatigued. For the first time, Selorans listened without interrupting. Varaki leaders talked without yelling, and Neris visionaries shared visions without derision. Of course, they fought. Humans usually fight, but this time it was different. They didn't dispute over who was better. They argued about who would live. One Seloran registrar said, "What law matters if there is no city to follow it?" A Varaki warrior asked, "What strength matters if the sea eats every ship?" A Neris singer muttered, "What dream matters if no one lives to hear it?" And so little by little they started to make plans together, not to fix what was broken, but to make something new. The sea had shown itself to be difficult to control, yet people were too tenacious to give up. The moons had proved their strength, but their silence had shown something else. They didn't take sides. They all pulled the same way. Finally, people began to comprehend. The moons did not divide people. They were 3 weights tugging the same planet, and if the residents of Reality 91 wanted to endure, they too had to pull together. The initial project was to stay alive. High Marsh couldn't fit everyone, so the survivors set out to fix what was left. They patched up cliff spires, carved halls, saved barges from Varak's teeth, and sealed the domes of Deep Reach. But this time they did it in a new way. Seloran scribes wrote down the work, but they didn't ask for oaths. The Varaki captains organized work, but they didn't tell people what to do. Neris dreamers painted the rebuilding, but they also listened to what other people had to say. The task was slow, awkward, and often full of problems, but it got done. Aaron turned out to be something he never thought he would be. A mediator. Not a soldier, not a priest, nor a singer, but a voice that spoke for all of them. When disputes threatened to disrupt the fragile togetherness, he reminded them of the stillness. "Do you remember?" he would ask. When all sounds stopped? When the sea itself stopped? In that moment we were not Seloran, Varaki, Nerisan. We were just people. Keep that. And sometimes they did listen. Years went by. Kids grew up who only remembered the eclipse, not the conflict. The 3 moons were not enemies for them. They were all part of the same experience of fear and survival. They played games where they pretended to be moons, not to fight, but to circle each other in a balanced way. Their delicate voices carried across markets as they sung songs of the silence. In Reality 91, for the first time, a generation was learning how to be one before they learned how to be separate. But ambition didn't go away. People couldn't live eternally in fear of the tides and the moon. They looked up again. The age of astronomy came back, not with guns but with interest. Telescopes got better. Seloran accuracy, Varaki fire, and Nerisan vision all worked together to redesign rockets that started to rise again. This time they didn't bring bombs. They brought beacons. The first successful launch was small, a capsule that went up high enough to see Selora before crashing back down. It landed intact, its contents filled with sand and shells carried as symbols by children from all 3 faiths. People cheered not for winning, but for optimism. Years later, the first living passengers went up, birds from High Marsh, encased in a glass dome with air. They came back alive, with ruffled feathers and pulsing hearts. People cried when they saw them. One child said, "If a bird can touch the sky, why can't we?" Aaron, who was older now, watched with pride. His body hurt and he walked slowly, yet he felt more alive than he had in years. He had lived through separation, conflict, and quiet. Now he lived to see something better, something real, but delicate and unsure. The city came together on the night of the first human attempt. The rocket towered over a platform made of old wood and iron that had been patched with stone from cliff spire, rope from Varak's teeth, and glass from Deep Reach. It was a creation of all moons, all people. There were 3 emblems on its side: a pale cord, a crimson flame, and a blue spiral. No one disagreed about which was better. They all got up together. The boom of the rocket launch shook the sea. The flames lighted up the night, making it brighter than Varak and louder than thunder. Not out of fear, but out of awe, the people of Highmarsh called out. The rocket went up and up until it was gone from view. There was a moment of stillness again. People held their breath and waited. Then a flare went off in the sky, white, crimson, and blue, and drifted down like fireflies. The rocket had reached the end of the sky and sent back its message. The crowd went wild. Selorans cried. The Varaki warriors hugged. Neris and singers sang not to predict the future, but to celebrate. For the first time, the 3 moons looked down on humans who had crossed the line into their territory. They were not separated children, but one people daring to climb. Aaron stood off to the side and watched the faces. He saw in them what he had always wanted. Not peace without strife or perfection, but balance. Like the moons themselves, they pull in different ways, but keep the globe together. As the 3 moons danced around each other that night, Aaron said one more prayer. It wasn't to Selora, Varak, or Neris. It was to the quiet between them. He said, "Thanks. To show us that we are more than your pull." The sea was angry below, as it always is. The moon shone above, calm, strong, and strange, and mankind, weak but strong, carried its fire aloft, hoping for a tide that no storm could shatter. The dream of a new tide has begun. Welcome to Beyond the Fractals. Subscribe now and explore every reality.